Hello and welcome to this talk on animal hormones. This talk will follow the Raven et al. Biology 10th edition book. So this is chapter 45 entitled The Endocrine System. In addition to that, I'm going to put two links here to the crash course on the endocrine system. Those are both excellent coverages of this system as well. The thing that we're going to study today is the hormones and how they are used within the animal body. And ultimately what this can be boiled down to is that the cells of the body make chemical messengers which can travel long distances within the body and provide targeted responses in other cells. So again, as a reminder, chapter 45. Please be careful as you look through this outline because I don't say on here memorize every single hormone. That's not important. I'm more interested in that you understand the organ systems and that you understand the way in which some of these hormones function. There are some slight differences between male and female in our case. The differences are pretty small though. Really they come down to things like the ovary and the testes being different. Obviously all the other organ systems are identical. All right, so if you understand what's happening in this picture, this is something like what hormones are doing. In the picture, this woman is actually working as an operator for a phone, and she's physically moving one plug to another location because someone who is in contact with her is asking to connect to another person. And this is something like what hormones do. They take a message from one cell and transfer it to another. Hormones are a chemical messenger, so they are composed of a variety of different things, but they're often actually composed of things like amino acids, though that's not the only thing they can be made of. And they get secreted into extracellular fluid and they act distantly from the location. So a cell will not secrete a hormone and then be the only cell that is acted upon, although it may be acted upon by that hormone. There's a number of major organs that play a role in this, and these are part of what we call the endocrine system, and they are found throughout the body. Additionally to the endocrine system, there is a type of thing called a paracrine regulator, and these are effectively the same thing as hormones, except that they act only locally. Okay, so not a huge difference here, but there are some slight nuances to that. There's a number of glands and organs which we're going to go through. There's the pineal gland located here up at number 1. There's a pituitary at number 2. There's a thyroid is number 3. The thymus is number 4. The adrenal glands are located at 5. The pancreas is 6. And then 7 and 8 are the ovaries and the testes. Also, just for the record, the brain is not rotated in this direction in an actual human. This brain is rotated to the side so you can actually see it. But the importance of that is so you can see the pineal and pituitary at the same time. And the other thing that I want to point out is, although I'm making a distinction here between the ovaries and the testes, the ovaries and testes are actually not very different, especially in humans. Testes are derived ovaries, so that means that during development, the human body begins to develop as if it were female. And then if it gets a certain signal, in this case testes determining factor is activated, then the ovaries actually will change shape, location, and function, and they will move to become testes. So by default in the human body, the body plan is female. If a signal is interpreted, then they become male. But just to be clear, that means that these organs are very, very similar in many, many aspects. All right, so I'm going to warn you right now that there's a number of lists in this chapter. There is some need for that, no doubt. That's important to understand. But I also want to be clear that my goal is not to have you memorize tons and tons of different things. Okay, so let's start with what a hormone actually is. So by definition, a hormone must be sufficiently complex to convey information. For instance, a single sugar molecule is not complex enough to convey information. And it must resist degradation long enough to reach some target so that that information can be conveyed. If you have a hormone that does not last in the body for, say, more than a moment, then it is unable to send a long distance or unable to send a long distance message. And so the importance of hormones is that while they are able to be degraded, that degradation is also limited. So it takes time to do that, and they can send the signal before they are degraded. Now, there's a number of things I want to point out here. I'm not worried about you worrying about this amine hormone up at the top. What I want you to understand are these other three classes of hormones. Peptide hormones are short chains of amino acids, and your book says peptides are really proteins that are less than 40 amino acids long. If they're longer than 40 amino acids, then they become true protein hormones. Okay, both of these things exist. You can see examples here. Oxytocin is a peptide. Human growth hormone, HGH, which was involved with a number of scandals related to baseball, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, is a true protein hormone. And then at the bottom is this thing called a steroid hormone. Whoa, that's cool. Look at that. It made a little peak like that. That's neat. My hand didn't move, so it's interesting the mouse did that. And in this case, what I want you to see is it's three 6-membered carbon rings linked to a 5-membered carbon ring. All of them will always have this structure. As a result, they tend to be relatively small. There's lots of little bits that can hang off the end of them. I'm not terribly worried you know about all the little bits, but I do want you to see this structure. Okay. There are also more categories now to hormones. So 3 different types of hormones. You can also roughly categorize them by how they interact with water. Groups that will dissolve easily in water are called, of course, hydrophilic, right? And these are generally active over very short periods of time. Think about why that might be the case. There's also another group that are called lipophilic, and these are generally active over much longer periods of time. And of course, they easily dissolve in lipids, but they have a very difficult time being transported or dissolving in water, right? Lipophilic hormones act inside cells, and this makes a lot of sense. So the outside and inside of a cell are often filled with lots of water, but their membrane is easy to pass across because that's made of lipid. So steroid hormones that are in the outside environment can move across that membrane very, very easily. And so while they may be in very low concentrations because they don't want to be in that water, they can move into the cell. And once they move into the cell, there's often a receptor that will pick them up and protect them from that watery environment, and that receptor will then go and act on things in the nucleus. It will often activate genes and begin transcripting material inside of the nucleus. What's important to appreciate here is that you now have seen, this is probably the first time you've seen, real active material moving into the nucleus. So of course, it makes sense that things have to get into the nucleus, although we've said in the past that it's very difficult to do so, but clearly things do, and this is one of those things that do, right? And so those pores that allow things into the nucleus and out of the nucleus are going to allow this hormone receptor complex in to begin the production of things like mRNA, which will lead to proteins, which will lead to changes in this cell, right? And as you know, proteins are really the fun part of the cell, right? So once that mRNA starts to produce proteins, whatever that cell is doing is going to change. Again, this is for a lipophilic, so a lipid-loving hormone. If you're a hydrophilic, this is really a very difficult problem, as you might anticipate. It's very difficult for hydrophilic things to pass that plasma membrane, as you know. Here, an excellent Lord of the Rings reference. Hydrophilic hormones are really not going to be able to move across that membrane, so they're going to have to get their signal to the cell some other way. One of the most common ways this occurs is that the hormone will bind with some sort of receptor that sticks on the outside in the extracellular fluid. That receptor will then often be linked to a G protein, as you have already seen in things like the sensory chapter where we looked at eye cells. They use a G protein receptor, right? And this is exactly the same kind of thing. The G protein allows there to be a hugely increased signal per cost. So every time a hormone arrives, that's just one molecule, but a G protein could activate thousands or millions of molecules potentially within the cell. And so a hormone can have a hugely outsized effect. And also, hence the reason you might need very little hormone in that case. The other advantage of this, G proteins are easy to turn on and off. Okay, and so it's very easy to have these things arrive, act quickly, make really strong responses, and then have the hormone be degraded or lost, and at that point the response will be turned back off. If you're not familiar with how G proteins work, this would be a good place to go familiarize yourself with it. I don't expect you to know really the level of detail you necessarily see in these pictures, but I'd like you to understand how G proteins expand a signal from one to many. And I'd like you to understand why they're called G proteins. Let's turn now to some of the organ systems. So we'll start at the top here, starting at the brain, and we'll work down. There's a couple of things to notice about the endocrine system in the brain. There's this thing called the pituitary, which is made of two bulbs. One is called the anterior, and that's the one that points towards the forward bits of your face. And there's a posterior, which points to the back, right? It's behind that one. In addition to that, there's this thing called the hypothalamus, okay? And there's a little bit of material that connects the two, infundibulum. I'm not worried that you know that, but understand that these are connected systems. So your book spends a long time talking about pituitary system and the exchange of information in it. And there's no reason why you can't appreciate this system and really understand it. But I don't want you to get bogged down with the stuff on page 948, which is a list of many of these hormones, and which is not going to help you as much as understanding how the system actually functions. So in the pituitary itself, endocrine cells will release compounds. Those compounds can be distributed throughout the body. But in addition to that, in the hypothalamus, there are actually neurosecretory cells that secrete compounds that can actually have an effect on the body, but can also affect the pituitary immediately. So there's this little tiny bridge across the capillaries. There's a lot of blood flow here, and there's a real importance of information being shuttled across. And again, I don't want you to know every one of them, but notice that there are some three major classes here. We have peptides, proteins, and then this other thing, which I haven't mentioned before, which are called glycoproteins, which appear. And really what these are proteins that have a ton of sugars on them. All right, and so that's going to make them really easy to dissolve in water. As you know, sugars are very easy to dissolve in water. Proteins often can be, but coating them in sugars will ensure that they are absolutely a hydrophilic compound. The other thing to keep in mind here, and this is your book and many other places mention this over and over again, is that if you were to pick one particularly important gland or portion of the endocrine system, it would in fact be this portion, the hypothalamus and the pituitary, because in some ways they secrete some of the most important endocrine compounds or the hormones into the body itself. Now, that's not to say that they secrete the only important ones or that every other endocrine system is therefore somehow unimportant to the two cells. Clearly, that's not the case, but these secrete a number of very important ones, and they occur very regularly. So clearly, this has regular day-to-day importance as well. Good, and I wanted to remind you, I brought myself to this. Please do not memorize all the hormones. The hormones that I want you to memorize, that you should understand, you know ADH from the kidneys, and we're going to look at a couple related to the pancreas, okay? But I would much rather you understand why those hormones have the effect they do and how they have those effect in a couple of cases rather than that you memorize every case. If you go into human A&P or human physiology, you'll need to know all these. And especially if you're going to be working with people who may have endocrine system problems, you're going to need to know these backwards and forwards, and they're going to have to just be routine for you. For the vast majority of biologists, this is probably not a necessary tool to pull off the shelf day to day, so you can go look them up if you need them. All right, let's move down a little bit further. Let's look at the thyroid. The thyroid, which is located on your neck, is actually really important for regulating metabolism. So your trachea passes through your thyroid. In the case of humans, there is some importance to the regulation of metabolism, no doubt. Humans do regulate their metabolism to a degree, but especially it's important in animals that go through regular seasonal cycles in temperature. So think about animals that live outside, right? Huge differences in the availability of food, and so regulating metabolism from something like some portion of the body is really critical for them, right? It's not helpful to go out and look for food in the middle of the winter when there is no food around. It's really risky. So you want to downregulate that organism's desire to feed. But as soon as you have food available in the spring, you want to upregulate that hunger so the organism moves right out again to start feeding, right? And again, I want to stress that your book says it's not as big a deal in humans. That is true in humans that live in stable environments with supermarkets. Certainly, humans that have been agrarian for thousands of years now have had relatively high periods of material and food and relatively low periods. That's been a normal portion of human history. Hence the reason we often have things like large parties and feasts in the end of fall when the food is being brought in, you eat as much as you can and put on weight, and then you wouldn't really have a feast again until there's some sort of harvesting going on, usually not until the end of spring again after that, right? After you've been able to get your early crops in. So even though we don't think of humans as needing the regulation of metabolism, it's still really important, and that's often because we feel disconnected from the environment. But this is certainly not true of many people around the world who live on a year-to-year basis and do have regular low periods of food production. Okay. The other thing that the thyroid is really important for, it's actually really important to stimulate and help the central nervous system develop as well. And so when it doesn't develop properly, or when it sends the wrong signals, or it doesn't have the right material to make the signals, then the CNS can be very poorly developed in humans, and that's going to lead to very serious ramifications, obviously. Your book mentioned something about causing metamorphosis in amphibians. That's fine. Thyroid does cause metamorphosis in amphibians. People get really excited about this. I want to be clear that metamorphosis in amphibians appears to be a very special case. It evolved only in that group and evolved only in that specific group of amphibians. The vast majority of amphibians that have ever lived never used metamorphosis, but all those groups went extinct. So by default, we see living amphibians with metamorphosis as the normal. But actually those are the exception to the rule. So while it's interesting and it has produced an enormous amount of information about the thyroid in that group, I don't want you to spend a long time thinking about it. And then lastly, I wanted to point out that the thyroid in part not only helps regulate metabolism, but it also helps regulate calcium levels. Okay, so calcium, as I've already mentioned, is a really important ion within the cells. We talked about them in nerves. They're going to be important for bone formation. They're going to be important for muscle contraction. It's going to be important for a lot of different elements of the body itself. So you should understand how and where this ion is being regulated. And here it's in the thyroid is partially responsible for that. All right, let's move a little bit further down the body and look at the adrenal glands. Many of us are familiar with the adrenal glands because if you've ever been startled, you felt that sudden shock and you get that sort of racing heart. You might break out in a sweat. Your eyes will often get dilated. That's exactly what the result of adrenaline being released by the adrenal glands. Okay, adrenal glands do more than produce adrenaline. I just want to point this out, that the medulla of the adrenal glands, here I'm going to highlight right down here, the medulla of the adrenal glands, which is really the internal area. So I'm going to highlight the medulla here on this adrenal gland. This section here is really the medulla. That's what has to do with adrenaline. The cortex actually deals with glucose and salt homeostasis, which makes a lot of sense, right? They're located right on top of the kidneys, and they should deal with something that the kidneys work with all the time, glucose and salt. And this looks like a big blob of fat often when you dissect it, but it really is a gland, and it has structure, and that it's really an important element to the body. So you can just chop it away and have a similar result. You can look at exactly what the cortex does and what the medulla does. I'm going to move forward. The one I do want you to be aware of that where I'm going to spend a little bit of time here is the pancreas. The pancreas is really important. It is really important for digestion. Okay, and one of the big things it does is it secretes enzymes, but it also secretes bicarb to help reduce the acid content of the food reaching the small intestine. Sorry. And how it does that is it actually has a little tiny duct that drops out right between the stomach and the the small intestine and it drips material out. This green thing up here is the gallbladder. That's going to get material from the liver. We're going to learn about that later. That is also really important. If you have your gallbladder removed, which is possible, you will find that that causes some issues, but survivable for sure. The pancreas, also if you lose your pancreas, you'll realize how seriously important the pancreas is. People dealing with type 1 diabetes understand the importance of the pancreas, and to a degree type 2 diabetes, although the pancreas actually is still functioning in type 2 diabetes, it appears to be an inappropriate response elsewhere in the body, which is interesting. The two hormones that the pancreas makes that's really important is it produces this thing called insulin. And insulin seems weird, but insulin instructs the body cells to take up glucose from the solution around them. So if you don't produce insulin, your body will actually be loaded up with glucose, but the cells will not pick it up, right? And it will pass by. And that's a really serious problem because glucose is what's going to keep them doing their normal cellular metabolism. And so without insulin, your body will ignore the glucose and will ultimately result in you losing a lot of weight and dying. And so the loss of this insulin would be a type 1 diabetes situation where the pancreas is damaged or lost, often to autoimmune disease, and that causes insulin production to go way down, which results in glucose being largely ignored by the body and the person wasting away, effectively starving to death while being soaked in nutrients. Okay, and the control of diabetes is actually fairly straight, or type 1 diabetes is actually fairly straightforward. It's just the regular addition of insulin to the body. And insulin is very straightforward to make. You can actually make human insulin from bacteria, and then people just monitor it in their blood. They monitor their blood sugar. They don't monitor the insulin directly. And their blood sugar goes up, they take a little insulin to bring it back down, and they can help control that. Very straightforward. The other thing that the pancreas does is the sort of inverse to this. It instructs I shouldn't say the inverse. It sends out a hormone which instructs cells to break down glycogen, which is the storage molecule of glucose in animals, into glucose. Okay, so if glucose is not available in the blood, the pancreas will say, okay, start breaking down glycogen to make glucose. If glucose is in the blood, the pancreas will say, okay, start taking up glucose, start to remove it from the system. And so the pancreas is really important in maintaining the correct quantity of glucose in and around the body. All right, let's look quickly here at the ovaries and testes. Unfortunately, in this class, we're not going to spend any time talking about reproductive systems. Reproductive systems are really, really interesting. But like I said, we won't have time in this course, so this is going to be basically the limit of that. As I mentioned earlier, the development of testes are actually directly related to ovaries, right? Testes are modified ovaries is the way you can think of it. Okay, that also means that in mammals, I should say this very clearly, in mammals, this is true. It will not be true necessarily in any other group, but because we're often focused on mammals, that's what we think about. The male reproductive system is also a very modified female reproductive system. So fetuses begin development producing a female type reproductive system, which is then modified to produce a male reproductive system. So you will see many, many similarities here in the structure between these two, and that's not coincidental. That's because these systems are very closely related to one another. Now, one of the things that people are often familiar with is that testes produce testosterone, right? And testosterone is actually a steroid that is a derivative of estrogen. So it's a modified female sex steroid, again, which makes perfect sense. And testosterone is important in fetuses to direct the body plan to male, but then again, very important in men to maintain secondary sexual characteristics and also the production of things like sperm. In females, the steroid is called estrogen, and of course that's critical for the menstrual cycle and also actually really critical for the production of the placenta for the developing fetus. Okay, and then the important thing about these is both of these levels must rise. They're important during development, but they're also really important in mammals during puberty, when the body is fully advancing its secondary sexual characteristics and maturing to be ready to reproduce. Right, and so both of these compounds must increase in quantity during that time to let the cells know, hey, it's time to start changing over, adopt these secondary sexual characteristics. Again, sorry, this is a very cool system. Really just giving it the short end of the stick here. Not very much information on it. If you are interested in reproductive systems, I encourage you to go look up more information. Of course, there's tons and tons of cool information about reproductive systems, and not just in humans. There's lots of cool reproductive systems out there. And I realize that this is sort of out of place, but I was trying to follow the book closely as I made this lecture. The pineal gland. Now, we've actually already talked about the pineal gland in POB2. This is that third eye. And what I want you to see on this picture to the left, this is a simple fish brain, and look at where that pineal body is located. It's located directly in the middle, where it would be exposed to light if there was a small amount of or small layer of skin above it. In the human, that pineal gland is fully covered, and you can see that that is covered not by just hair, but also by bone, but by a huge amount of other nerve cells, right? That cerebral hemisphere fully covers it, so there's no way the pineal gland can see. It actually is still innervated by optic nerves, so the optic nerves actually come up here, and some of the information is donated to the pineal gland, so it still, quote, sees. But it has a really important job in secreting this hormone called melatonin. And melatonin is very important in circadian rhythm. And you'll very badly confuse your pineal gland if, and this is what you get when what is called jet lag, when you go on long trips and your day-night cycle changes very, very drastically. The melatonin is still secreted as though the day-night cycle was the one that you had adopted earlier, right, that you came from, but you're in a very different location, and so you'll feel tired at the wrong time and you'll feel awake at the wrong time. Usually this will resolve itself in a couple of days, right? So the pineal gland is very adaptive, and it has the ability to respond very, very quickly. So it catches up a few hours every day. And so usually within 2 or 3 days, most people get over jet lag because they're able the pineal glands are able to recalibrate. Hence the reason if you go on long business trips, my recommendation is to immediately adopt the local time zones because it will help get you through it faster. But if you're only going to be there for 48 hours, do not try. Your pineal gland will not keep up with you in time. And I just wanted to show you that this is a lamprey, right? A good primitive fish. Here is that pineal gland. I'm going to circle it. You can see it right there, located on top of the head, collecting information, providing very obvious information about whether it's light outside or it's dark outside. Again, that third eye situation. And you can see that it's just in an area with very lightly colored skin. And so all it has to do is detect if there's light coming in or if there's not light cutting in. It becomes a problem in these other groups when things grow over top of it, and you have to modify that to provide information. All right, so that's the end of this lecture. Again, I'm going to post a number of things in it. I really strongly recommend that you watch the other videos that I post, and you need to read the book. There's simply far too much information in this chapter to simply digest into a single lecture without boring you to death. The next lecture, though, will be plant nutrition, and then my final lecture, animal nutrition, will follow after that.